elements 5 and 6, and that the threat itself was unequivocal, element 4 of the culprit. Now, if we take a look at the fear Ms. Sawyer-Smith had been put in, it is merely speculation to say that she had gone about her daily routine and ended her night at home. Perhaps she went home because she was in fear. The defense has claimed that she had taken no measures to protect her life, but she had. She had got home to her private property, also protected by her First Amendment rights, bolted the door shut, and went into her room.
So did she watch a movie and eat popcorn because she was in fear?
We do not know if she had eaten popcorn, Your Honor, but we do know she was watching a movie. Now, however, we could see from the swatting incident that happened later that day that the SWAT team had to break down Ms. Sawyer-Smith's door because even after they had knocked for several minutes and after using a megaphone to call Ms. Sawyer-Smith, she had not opened the door. The SWAT team had to break in, yell Ms. Sawyer to freeze, and Ms. Sawyer-Smith was hurt in the ambulance and taken to the hospital. Now, we can see from the situation that Ms. Sawyer-Smith, after being taken to the hospital, claims that she knew who did this. And Officer Keegan Lopez writes in her witness statements that Ms. Sawyer-Smith said, "I know who did this. It was Reagan Klein." And so we can reasonably infer, that Ms. Sawyer-Smith had been in sustained fear for the duration of the night, up until the moment she was swatted, up until the moment the SWAT team had broken down her door, that Ms. Sawyer-Smith had been in fear.
But she didn't call the police, right?
Yes, Your Honor. As in the case of People v. Chandler, a victim can show such statements, make such statements as she had that day, even when they are in sustained fear, because victims can have a desire to not show that fear to the defendant as Ms. Sawyer-Smith had. And Ms. Sawyer-Smith, more than any other person, would have had a more reasonable, a greater purpose in making such statements because she had a reputation to uphold. We know that Ms. Sawyer-Smith had a reputation amongst the thousands, tens of thousands of followers.
So is that your explanation for her response, the LOL, as if response?
Yes, Your Honor. She writes in her witness statement, quote, "I was totally freaked out, but I tried to play it chill so my followers would think I was tough." And if we once again take a look at the case of People v. Chandler, we can see that the victim can make such statements even when they are in sustained fear because they might have a desire to not show that fear. And that is why in the case of People v. Chandler, the court also upheld a ruling of yes, that it was a true threat, even though there were surrounding circumstances regarding the threat.
You can continue.
As is this case today. Not only is the threat unequivocal, because Ms. Reagan Klein writes in her witness statements the clear, obvious motive that she writes, quote, "You think you could stick me with a $34,000 lawsuit and just get away with it? Watch your back, Sawyer, I'm coming for you." Dropping her name in there to communicate clearly and directly to Ms. Sawyer-Smith the threat that had been made and clearly intended for that threat to be communicated to Ms. Sawyer-Smith.
But okay, so you say it's a threat, right? But what is it a threat to do? I mean, there's nothing here that the defendant is threatening to do specifically. It has to be a specific threat, right?
No, Your Honor. In the case of People v. Martinez, we can see that the court still upheld a holding of the fact that it was a true threat, even though the words of the threat were vague themselves because of the surrounding circumstances. And if we take a look at People v. Martinez, we can see that the defendant said vague words to the victim, but the court still held that it was a true threat because of the conduct that the defendant followed through with that day. In the case of People v. Martinez, we can see that the defendant had later committed arson. And in that case, the defendant was later charged with arson and criminal threats, in which case the arson was used as evidence to back up the conduct suggested to kill in the second count, the criminal threats, as is similar to this case today. Though the defendants may have made vague words with no specific action involved, the defendant followed up with conduct suggesting to kill, which was the swatting incident. The defendant is here today on 2 counts, criminal threats and false text to tip.
You can continue.
Not only do we have conduct suggested to kill, as is the case in People v. Martinez, a case directly analogous to the case at bar, we have evidence of a history of animosity. As Your Honor had mentioned before, there was a prolonged period of time in which the two parties were at each other's throats. Ms. Sawyer-Smith had dropped the defendant as a friend, and the defendant did not take that well. In response, catfished vanquished Miss Sawyer Smith, and Miss Sawyer Smith again got Miss Reagan Klein fired from her job, which she had been working for 5 years and had loved. And so the defendant, in response, threatens Miss Sawyer Smith with a clear motive and with clear intent. So the Reagan Klein had shown to Miss Sawyer Smith why she had done so with the clear intentions and clear words. As we can see in the case of DC versus RR. The similarities between DC versus RR and in this case R1 is that the threat was sent electronically and the threat had grammatically perfect sentences. Now yes, the threats that Miss Reagan Klein may have made may have been vague sentences. I'm going to get you, you deserve to die. But when in conjunction with the cohesive piece and the fact that it was sent electronically and that there were grammatical perfect sentences, we can conclude that Miss Reagan Klein had deliberation when she wrote the threat. The deliberation in which the whole process was taken, which she had to think of the threat, write the threat out, look for any errors, and drag the mouse over to the send button and communicate that to Miss Sawyer Smith.
Well, okay, so let me ask you this. So you've got kind of vague, non-specific threats. You've got some conduct that is maybe improper, right? Animosity between the parties. But what am I supposed to do with People versus Jackson? The guy pulls out an AK-47, sits on the porch, and that's not a true threat. Sounds to me like what you've got is a lot less than that.
Yes, Your Honor. However, in this case, as opposed to People versus Jackson, the defendant was not in a clear line of sight without any weapon, as the defendant in the case of People versus Jackson had. No, the victim was at home in fear for her life, where she had not known where the defendant was. The defendant could be anywhere, planning her next threat, planning her next conduct, planning her next harm that she could inflict to Miss Sawyer Smith. Miss Sawyer Smith did not know, as the landlords in People versus Jackson had, as opposed to this case. And so Miss Reagan Klein, we can see from the evidence of the day, had followed through with the threat in the conduct of Just to Kill, which was the swatting incident.
You can continue.
Now, once again, the defendant had made a threat, and this threat was unequivocal for the reasons being there was a clear motive, the $34,000 lawsuit, and the specific intent which was communicated in his words, "Watch your back." Sawyer stating the victim's name specifically,
30 seconds.
and in the fear that Miss Sawyer Smith had felt that day, that she had gone to her home, locked the doors, and hid in her room, and the actions between the parties that had led to a history of animosity that we can see clear evidence for.